The fluorescent lights above my head buzzed with that particular frequency that meant they'd burn out soon, and of course there was no money in the budget to replace them. Just like there was no money for the peeling paint on the walls, or the outdated blood pressure cuff that gave readings off by 10 points, or the air conditioning that had been broken since July. It was 11 p.m. on a Friday night at the West Side Community Clinic, and I was alone because Sandra had called in sick again, which probably meant she'd found another job and just hadn't told Dr. Chen yet, and I couldn't blame her because this place paid barely above minimum wage for work that demanded everything you had. My name is Maya Torres. I'm 28 years old, and I've been working double shifts for 3 months straight because my younger sister Elena has leukemia, and even with insurance, the treatment costs are drowning me in debt that grows faster than I can pay it down. The photo on my desk shows Elena at her high school graduation last year before the diagnosis, her smile bright and her dark hair long, not like now when the chemo has taken both the hair and most of the smiles. I touched the frame briefly before turning back to organize the supply cabinet, counting bandages and antiseptic wipes and trying not to think about the student loan notices stuffed in my bag, the ones that said my deferment period was ending and payments would resume next month. Outside the scratched windows, rain had started to fall in sheets, drumming against the glass and mixing with the ever-present soundtrack of sirens that never seemed to stop in this neighborhood. The clinic was located in the kind of area where people didn't call ambulances because they couldn't afford them, where gunshot wounds were treated with street medicine and questions were dangerous, where I'd learned to keep my head down and my observations to myself. I'd grown up not far from here, knew these streets, knew the desperation that brought people through our doors at all hours, seeking help they couldn't get anywhere else. Dr. Chen had left at 9 after the last scheduled patient, trusting me to close up and handle any walk-ins, which was probably a violation of about 15 different medical protocols, but this place ran on necessity rather than rules. My scrubs were wrinkled from the double shift, coffee-stained and smelling faintly of antiseptic and the particular odor of human suffering that you can never quite wash out. My shoulders ached, my feet hurt, and I had 4 more hours before I could go home to my cramped studio apartment and collapse into bed for maybe 5 hours before my shift at Memorial Hospital started. But I stayed because people needed this clinic, because Elena needed her treatments, because I'd taken an oath to help people even when they couldn't help themselves, and because somewhere in the exhaustion and debt and endless grind, I still believed that what I did mattered. The door burst, or open with such force that it slammed against the wall, and 3 men stumbled inside, the first 2 practically carrying the third, who was clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers and soaked through what had probably been a very expensive suit. My training kicked in before my fear could catch up, and I was moving toward them before I'd consciously decided to, already reaching for gloves from the box mounted on the wall. The wounded man was strikingly handsome even in pain, late 20s maybe, with dark hair and eyes that caught mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch, and when he spoke his voice was low and commanding despite the blood loss. No hospitals. The 2 men helping him were built like walls, wearing identical black suits that were perfectly tailored, and I could see the way their free hands stayed inside their jackets, in a way that made my stomach clench because I'd seen enough in this neighborhood to know what that meant. "Sir, a gunshot wound requires emergency medical attention," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and professional even as my hands started to shake. "You need a trauma surgeon, imaging, possibly surgery if the bullet hit bone or major vessels." "Then do what you can here," he said, and it wasn't a request. "Now." His men helped him to the exam table in the small treatment room, and I found myself following, my mind already cataloging what I had available, what I could do with limited supplies, how to treat a gunshot wound with nothing but basic clinic equipment. The harsh overhead light turned everything stark and clinical as blood dripped onto the cracked linoleum floor, each drop marking time like a countdown. The 2 men in suits positioned themselves by the windows, watching the street outside with the kind of vigilance that told me they expected trouble, expected more violence, expected whatever had put a bullet in their boss to follow them through my door. I pulled on gloves with trembling fingers and approached the wounded man who sat on my exam table like it was a throne, his posture straight despite the pain that had to be radiating through his shoulder. His suit jacket was ruined, the fabric saturated with blood, and when I carefully peeled it back, I could see the entry wound high on his left shoulder, clean-edged, still bleeding freely. "I need to cut away your shirt," I said, reaching for scissors. And he nodded once, that intense gaze never leaving my face, even as I began cutting through expensive fabric. The wound was through and through, I realized with relief. No bullet to extract, just tissue damage and bleeding to control. One of his men cleared his throat, a sound that carried warning, and I looked up to see him staring at me with cold eyes. "You tell anyone about this?" he started. But the wounded man cut him off with a single word that sounded like a command in a language I didn't recognize. "I'm a nurse," I said quietly, meeting those intense dark eyes again. "I help people. That's all this is." I worked in tense silence, my hands shaking slightly as I irrigated the wound with saline, cleaning away blood to assess the damage more clearly, and I could feel his eyes on my face the entire time, never once looking down at what I was doing to his shoulder. The bullet had passed cleanly through the muscle, missing the major vessels and bone by what seemed like impossible luck. And as I worked, I noticed other scars on his skin, old marks that told stories of violence, a puckered knife wound along his ribs, what looked like an old bullet scar on his abdomen, the kind of damage that spoke to a life I couldn't begin to imagine. His watch was a Patek Philippe, the kind that cost more than I made in a year, and his clothes, even ruined and blood-soaked, were clearly custom-tailored, the fabric quality evident even in its destroyed state. The two men by the windows never stopped their vigilant watch, and the way they deferred to him, the way they'd carried him in and positioned themselves to protect him, told me this man was someone important, someone dangerous, someone I should probably be more afraid of than I was. "You're good at this," he said suddenly, his voice steady despite what had to be considerable pain as I debrided the wound, and I found myself responding without thinking. "I'm a nurse. It's my job." "Most people would have called the police," he observed. And there was something in his tone, curiosity maybe, or assessment, like he was trying to figure out what kind of person I was. "Most people aren't $40,000 in debt," I replied, the words slipping out before I could stop them, and I felt my face flush because I didn't know why I'd said that, didn't know why I was being honest with this stranger who'd brought violence and blood into my clinic. I applied antibiotic ointment and began packing the wound with gauze, my movements practiced and efficient despite my trembling hands, and he didn't flinch, didn't make a sound even though I knew it had to hurt. His eyes were so dark they were almost black, and the intensity of his gaze made something flutter in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a pull I didn't want to acknowledge. I could see the strength in his jaw, the sharp line of his cheekbones, the way his lips pressed together not in pain, but in concentration as he studied my face like he was memorizing every detail. "This needs stitches," I said, reaching for the suture kit. "But you really should go to a hospital for proper imaging. There could be damage I can't see." He shook his head once, definitive, and I sighed and threaded the curved needle, knowing I was going to do this regardless of my protests, because he clearly wasn't going anywhere, and leaving a wound like this open was asking for infection. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows, and somewhere in the distance another siren wailed, the soundtrack of this neighborhood, the sound of other people's emergencies while I dealt with my own. I finished the last stitch and bandaged his shoulder with practiced efficiency, and when I stepped back he stood smoothly, testing the range of motion with a slight wince that he tried to hide. One of his men helped him into a clean shirt they'd apparently brought, and I watched as he buttoned it with steady fingers, the expensive fabric settling over the bulk of the bandage. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a money clip thick with bills, and before I could process what he was doing, he'd peeled off a stack and set it on the counter, the cash sitting there like an accusation. "I can't accept this," I said immediately, my hands automatically moving to push it back toward him, but he was already walking toward the door. "You already have," he replied, his voice carrying that same command that made it clear he expected to be obeyed. The money sat there, and I found myself staring at it, my nursing ethics warring with the desperate reality of my financial situation, and when I quickly counted the bills, I felt my stomach drop because it was $5,000, exactly enough to cover Elena's treatment bills for next month, with some left over for my own crushing debt. "Don't come to work alone again," he said from the doorway, and the way he said it, the certainty in his voice, made something cold slide down my spine. Maya Torres. "How do you know my name?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, fear finally catching up to the adrenaline that had carried me through the treatment. He gestured toward my chest, and I looked down at my name tag, the plastic badge I'd worn so long I forgot it was there. But when I looked back up, there was something in his eyes that suggested he'd known my name before he ever saw that tag. A business card joined the money on the counter, heavy cardstock with embossed lettering that read Dante Moretti and a phone number, nothing else. "In case you need anything," he said. And the way he emphasized anything made it sound like both a promise and a threat, anything at all. Then he was gone, his men flanking him as they moved through the rain toward a black SUV with tinted windows that had been idling at the curb, and I stood in my empty clinic with $5,000 in cash and a business card that felt heavier than it should. The rain poured down outside, washing blood from the sidewalk where they'd helped him from the car, erasing evidence like it had never happened. I picked up the card with trembling fingers, studying the name I didn't recognize, wondering who this man was, and why the weight of his gaze had made me feel both terrified and safe at the same time. The money mocked me from the counter, temptation wrapped in $100 bills, and I thought about Elena's next round of chemotherapy, about the collection notices in my bag, about how easy it would be to just accept this payment and pretend it was normal, pretend that what had just happened was just another patient seeking help. I made it home just after 3 in the morning and collapsed onto my second-hand couch without even changing out of my scrubs. But sleep wouldn't come because every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those intense dark eyes watching me while I worked, the way he'd said my name like he already knew me. The business card sat on my coffee table where I'd placed it, after taking the cash and hiding it in my apartment with shaking hands, the embossed letters catching the weak morning light filtering through my single window. Dante Moretti. I grabbed my laptop and typed his name into the search bar, telling myself I just needed to know, needed to understand who had walked into my clinic last night. The first results were innocuous enough: a professional website for Moretti import and export, mentions in business journals about shipping contracts and warehouse acquisitions, photos from charity galas where he stood in a perfect tuxedo beside beautiful women in glittering dresses. He looked legitimate, successful, exactly the kind of wealthy businessman who might end up at a community clinic by accident. But then I kept scrolling and found the article that made my stomach drop and my breath catch in my throat, a piece from 2 years ago in the Herald about organized crime in the city, and there was his name again surrounded by words like alleged and suspected and under investigation. I clicked through to more articles, each one painting a darker picture. References to the Moretti crime family, to territory disputes and federal investigations, to his father Antonio Moretti, who had died 6 years ago in what was officially ruled a heart attack but unofficially whispered to be an assassination. The words blurred together on my screen as the reality crashed over me like ice water. I had treated a mafia boss. I had cleaned and stitched the wound of someone involved in organized crime, had taken his money, had let him walk out of my clinic without reporting a gunshot wound which was legally required. What have I done? I thought, pressing my hands to my face. I helped a criminal. But he was bleeding, Would have died maybe if the wound had gotten infected or if he'd gone into shock. The Hippocratic Oath didn't have exceptions for criminals, did it? Doctors and nurses treated gang members and drug dealers and murderers all the time. That was part of the job. We didn't get to choose who deserved care based on their moral character. But this felt different somehow. More personal, more dangerous. And I couldn't shake the memory of his men with their hands inside their jackets, the way they'd watch the windows like they expected an attack. I should call the police, report what had happened, turn over the business card and the money, and wash my hands of the whole situation. But if I did that, I'd lose my license for not reporting immediately, might face charges for aiding a criminal, and the money would be confiscated, and Elena's treatment, bills would still be due. I forced myself to get 3 hours of sleep before my shift at Memorial Hospital started at noon, and I showed up with concealer under my eyes and coffee in my hand, trying to pretend that everything was normal, even though I felt like my skin was crawling with paranoia. Memorial was a real hospital with real funding and working equipment, and enough staff that I didn't have to do the work of 3 people, and normally I loved my shifts here. Loved the organized chaos of the emergency department and the competent team I worked with. But today I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And when I walked through the main lobby, I saw 2 men in dark suits standing near the entrance. Their posture too alert, their eyes scanning the crowd in a way that made my heart hammer against my ribs. They could have been anyone, visiting family members or pharmaceutical reps or hospital administrators, but all I could see were the men who'd flanked Dante Moretti last night, the way their hands had stayed inside their jackets. I hurried to the staff elevator, my badge trembling in my hand as I swiped it, and I told myself I was being ridiculous, that not every man in a suit was connected to organized crime, that my guilt and fear were making me see threats that didn't exist. The ER was busy with the usual Friday night aftermath that stretched into Saturday, car accidents and domestic violence and overdoses, and I threw myself into my work, trying to lose myself in the familiar rhythm of triage and treatment. But I kept seeing dark suits in my peripheral vision, kept feeling eyes on me every time I walked through a hallway or stepped outside for a break. Sarah, one of the other nurses who'd worked with me for 2 years, pulled me aside during lunch. "Are you okay?" she asked, her brown eyes concerned behind her glasses. "You seem jumpy today, like you're expecting something bad to happen." I forced a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "Just tired," I said. "Too many double shifts, not enough sleep." She studied me for a moment longer, clearly not convinced, but then her pager went off and she had to run to a trauma coming in, and I was left alone with my racing thoughts and the paranoia that felt more justified with every passing hour. I saw another man in a suit on the 3rd floor when I went to check on a patient we'd admitted, and this one actually made eye contact with me, holding my gaze for a beat too long before looking away. My hand shook as I updated the patient's chart, and I had to read the medication orders 3 times before I trusted myself not to make a mistake. This was insane. I was being insane, letting one night in a clinic with a dangerous man completely upend my sense of safety and normalcy. I finished my shift at Memorial and drove through the gathering darkness to the clinic for my evening hours, and the exhaustion was so bone deep that I almost called Dr. Chen to say I couldn't make it, but Elena's treatment bills wouldn't pay themselves, and I needed every shift I could get. The clinic looked the same as always when I unlocked the door. The same peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights, and faint smell of antiseptic. But it felt different now, tainted by what had happened here last night, by the blood on the linoleum and the dangerous man who'd sat on my exam table. I'd been there maybe 20 minutes, just long enough to turn on the lights and start organizing supplies, when the door burst open and 3 men rushed in, and I knew immediately these were not Dante's men, because everything about them was different, rougher, more threatening, their suits cheaper, and their movements aggressive rather than controlled. "Where is he?" the largest one demanded, his accent thick and Russian, each word heavy with menace. "The man you treated last night, where did he go?" "I don't know who you're talking about," I said, my voice coming out high and thin as I backed away, my hip hitting the reception desk. "I'm a nurse. I treat lots of people." "Don't lie," another one snarled, moving to block the door while the third one advanced on me. "We have cameras across the street. We know Dante Moretti was here. We know you helped him." His hand shot out and grabbed my arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, and then he was slamming me against the wall, my head cracking against the plaster hard enough to make stars burst across my vision. I treated a gunshot wound. I gasped, terror clawing up my throat. "I don't know where he went. He left. That's all I know." The third man was already behind the reception desk, yanking open drawers and scattering papers across the floor, looking for what I didn't know, maybe an address or a phone number or some evidence of where Dante had gone. "Maybe you need motivation," the one holding me said, and I saw the flash of a knife blade as he pulled it from his jacket, the metal catching the fluorescent light. The tip of the blade pressed against my throat, cold and sharp, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the pressure of that knife and know with absolute certainty that these men would kill me without hesitation if they thought it would get them what they wanted. "Please," I whispered, tears burning in my eyes. "I don't know anything. I just treated his wound. He didn't tell me where he was going." The knife pressed harder against my throat, and I felt a warm trickle of blood where the tip had broken skin. And then the world exploded into violence and noise as the windows shattered inward in a spray of glass and gunfire erupted from outside. The man holding me jerked back, his grip loosening, and I dropped to the floor behind the reception desk as bullets tore through the clinic, punching holes in walls and sending supplies scattering. I screamed, my hands covering my head, the sound of gunfire so loud it felt like my eardrums would burst. And through the chaos, I heard shouting in that same language Dante's men had used last night. The door burst open and I risked looking up to see Dante striding in with 3 of his men, a gun in his hand, his face cold and murderous in a way that terrified me almost as much as the knife had. The firefight lasted maybe 30 seconds, but felt like an eternity. The Russian who'd held the knife to my throat going down with a bullet to the chest, the other 2 scrambling for the back exit as Dante's men pursued them with deadly efficiency. Then there was silence except for the ringing in my ears and the sound of sirens in the distance growing closer, and Dante was there, pulling me up from behind the desk, his hands on my shoulders as he turned me to face him. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes scanning my face and body with frantic intensity. "Did they hurt you?" "What's happening?" I gasped, my whole body shaking so hard I could barely stand, and he steadied me, one hand moving to the cut on my throat where blood still seeped slowly. "They're Volkov's men," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "They're looking for me. They must have been watching the clinic, waiting to see if I'd come back." "You brought them here," I said, anger cutting through my shock and fear. "You brought this violence to my clinic. Those men could have killed me." "And I came back for you," he replied, and something in his voice made me look up to meet his eyes. "I had my men watching. I knew they were here. I came back for you." His thumb brushed across my cheekbone and I realized I was crying, tears streaming down my face, mixing with the dust and debris that covered everything. "We need to leave now," he continued, already guiding me toward the door, even as I tried to pull away. "The police are coming, and you can't be here when they arrive. You can't answer their questions about what happened." The clinic was destroyed, glass crunching under our feet, papers scattered everywhere, bullet holes in the walls like deadly punctuation marks, and the smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air, making me gag. His hand was firm on my arm as he pulled me toward the black SUV idling outside, and I tried to dig my heels in, tried to resist, but he was so much stronger than me, and my legs felt like water after the attack. "I need to call the police," I said, fumbling for my phone in my pocket. "I need to report what happened. Those men attacked me, they—" He plucked the phone from my hand before I could finish, slipping it into his jacket with a finality that made my chest tighten with panic. "The police can't protect you from Viktor Volkov," he said, and the name meant nothing to me, but the way he said it made my blood run cold. "This is kidnapping!" I shouted, finally finding my voice as he opened the SUV door and practically lifted me inside. "You can't just take me. I have rights. I have a life." "This is protection," he countered, sliding in beside me as the door slammed shut and the vehicle lurched into motion, tires squealing on wet pavement. "And that, life ended the moment you let me through your door last night." The city blurred past the tinted windows as we accelerated through rain-slicked streets, traffic lights smearing into streaks of red and green, and I pressed myself against the far door, as far from him as I could get in the confined space. "You helped me," he said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "Now they think you know where I am, what I'm planning. They think you're valuable to me. They'll torture you for information you don't have, and when they realize you really don't know anything, they'll kill you anyway just to send me a message." "I want my life back," I said, and I hated how my voice broke, hated the tears that wouldn't stop falling. "I want to go home. I want to check on my sister. I want to pretend last night never happened." He turned to look at me, and in the passing streetlights, I could see his face clearly for the first time since he'd burst into the clinic. And he looked younger than I'd thought, late 20s maybe, and strikingly handsome, even with the fury and guilt warring in his dark eyes. "Your sister is safe," he said. "I have men watching her at the hospital, watching your apartment, watching everyone connected to you, and you can't go back to any of it until Volkov is dealt with." "How long will that take?" I demanded, wiping at my tears with shaking hands. "Days, weeks," he replied grimly. "However long it takes to end this war before it costs more innocent lives." The SUV took a corner too fast, and I grabbed the handle above the door, my body sliding toward him before I caught myself, and I thought about Elena in her hospital bed, about my coworkers who would wonder where I'd gone, about the life I'd built from nothing that was crumbling around me because I'd made the mistake of helping a wounded stranger. The penthouse was on the 40th floor of a building I'd only ever seen from the outside, one of those glass and steel towers downtown where apartments started at $3 million, and when the elevator doors opened directly into the living space, I felt my breath catch, despite everything, because it was stunning in a way I'd never experienced outside of magazines. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 2 full walls, offering a view of the city sprawling below like a carpet of lights. And the furniture was all clean lines and expensive fabrics, abstract art on the walls that probably cost more than my entire year's salary. "This is your room," Dante said, guiding me down a hallway to a bedroom that was larger than my entire studio apartment, with a king-sized bed dressed in what felt like silk sheets and an ensuite bathroom finished in marble. "You'll stay here until it's safe," he continued, and I noticed the way he positioned himself in the doorway, not quite blocking it, but making his presence impossible to ignore. I turned to look at the room properly and saw designer clothes already hanging in the closet, all in my size, and toiletries arranged in the bathroom, expensive brands I recognized from commercials but had never been able to afford. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Since last night," he admitted. I knew Volkov would make a move, knew anyone connected to me would be at risk. "My phone. I need my phone. I need to call my sister." He pulled it from his pocket and handed it to me, and I snatched it away, scrolling through the missed calls and texts, my heart hammering when I saw Elena's name. I called her back with shaking fingers, and when she answered, her voice was bright and normal, asking about the work training trip I'd apparently told her about. "What training trip?" I asked, confusion cutting through my anger. "The one at that hospital in Boston," she said. "For the new trauma protocols, you texted me yesterday about it." I looked at Dante, who watched me with those dark eyes, and I understood that he'd had someone send that text, create that cover story, manage my life without my permission. I kept my voice steady as I talked to Elena, asking about her treatment, about how she was feeling, trying not to let her hear the fear and rage in my voice. When I hung up, I threw the phone at him, not caring that he caught it easily. "You had no right," I said. "No right to control my life. to lie to my sister, to make decisions for me. I did what was necessary to protect both of you, he replied calmly. Volkov won't hesitate to use her against you if he thinks it will draw you out. An hour later, there was a knock on my door, and one of the suited guards informed me that Mr. Moretti requested my presence for dinner. And the formal way he said it made the whole situation feel even more surreal, like I was a guest at some twisted hotel rather than a prisoner in a gilded cage. I wanted to refuse, wanted to lock myself in that beautiful bedroom and pretend none of this was happening, but my stomach was empty and my curiosity was stronger than my anger, so I followed the guard to a dining room with a table that could seat 12, but was set for only 2. Candles flickering in crystal holders and rain drumming against floor-to-ceiling windows. Dante was already there, changed out of the clothes from the clinic attack into dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, and he stood when I entered with a courtesy that seemed absurd given the circumstances. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, and I sat stiffly, arms crossed over my chest, making it clear I was here under protest. A man I assumed was a private chef brought out plates of food, pasta in a cream sauce that smelled incredible, fresh bread, a salad with vegetables that looked like they'd been picked that morning, and I hated that my mouth watered because I didn't want to enjoy anything about this situation. "Why are the Volkovs after you?" I asked bluntly, not touching my fork. "Territory dispute," he replied, taking a sip of wine from a glass I noticed he'd poured for himself, but not for me, respecting that I might not want alcohol or might not trust him enough to drink it. "My family controls the port, the shipping routes, most of the import business in this city. They want it, have wanted it for years, and they're willing to start a war to take it." "Why did you come to my clinic?" I pressed. "Of all the places in this city, why there?" "It was close," he said, and something in his voice made me believe him. I'd been shot, I was bleeding, I needed help immediately, and your clinic was 3 blocks away. It was random, Maya. But now, I'm not random, I said, the words bitter in my mouth. Now I'm a target because I happened to be working that night, because I did my job and helped someone who needed it. He set down his wine glass and leaned forward, and in the candlelight I could see the regret in his eyes, the genuine guilt that softened the hard lines of his face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never meant for you to be pulled into this, never meant for my world to touch yours. If I could go back and choose a different clinic, a different nurse, I would." We ate in tense silence for a while, and I found myself watching the way he moved, noticing the slight stiffness in his left shoulder, the way he favored his right arm when reaching for the bread, the subtle wince he tried to hide when he shifted in his chair. "Your shoulder," I said abruptly, my nurse training overriding my anger. "You're favoring it. Is the wound infected?" He touched it reflexively, a gesture that told me it was bothering him more than he wanted to admit. "It's fine," he said, but I was already standing, already moving around the table with my hands on my hips. "Let me see it," I demanded. "Now." He studied me for a moment, something like amusement flickering in his dark eyes, and then he stood and led me down another hallway to what was clearly his bedroom, all masculine lines and dark colors, a massive bed with charcoal sheets and windows that looked out over the glittering city. "There's a medical kit in the bathroom," he said, and I found it, a professional trauma kit that had everything I could possibly need, and when I came back out, he'd already removed his shirt and was sitting on the edge of the bed. I approached with clinical detachment, or at least I tried to, but it was impossible not to notice the sculpted muscles of his chest and abdomen, the way candlelight from the hallway cast shadows across his skin, the sheer physical presence of him. The bandage I'd applied was soaked through with blood and yellowish fluid, and when I peeled it away carefully, I could see the wound was indeed inflamed, the edges red and angry. "You didn't keep it clean," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I told you it needed to be cleaned daily, that you needed to watch for signs of infection." "I've been busy," he replied, and there was dark humor in his voice. "Starting wars, rescuing nurses, the usual." I cleaned the wound with perhaps more force than necessary, and he didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, even though I knew it had to hurt. And as I worked, my fingers traced over the other scars I'd noticed that first night: the puckered knife wound along his ribs, the old bullet scar near his abdomen, a long, thin line across his collarbone that looked surgical. "Knife fight. When I was 17, he said quietly, following my gaze to the scar on his ribs. "The bullet was 2 years ago. Different territory dispute. This one," he touched the surgical scar, "was from when I was 12 and thought I could climb the oak tree in my mother's garden." I found myself almost smiling at that last one, at the image of him as a boy, doing normal boy things before violence became his reality. "You've lived a violent life," I said softly, applying fresh antibiotic ointment. "And you've dedicated yours to healing," he replied, his eyes intense on my face. "We're opposites, Maya, light and dark, but maybe that's why I can't stop thinking about you." I couldn't sleep despite the exhaustion that pulled at my bones, couldn't stop my mind from racing through everything that had happened in the past 36 hours, and around 2 in the morning I gave up and left my room, padding barefoot through the silent penthouse in the pajamas someone had left for me. I found Dante in a study I hadn't seen before, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound books, sitting behind a massive desk of dark wood with papers spread before him and a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up when I entered, and something in his expression told me he'd been expecting me, had maybe been waiting for this conversation. "Why does this feel personal?" I demanded without preamble, standing in the doorway with my arms wrapped around myself. "Not just the protection, not just the guilt, but the way you look at me like you already know me." He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with those dark eyes, and then he set down his glass with deliberate care. "I didn't find your clinic randomly," he said finally. "After I was shot, after my men got me in the car, I told them to research nearby medical facilities. Your name flagged in our system." My blood ran cold, and I took an involuntary step backward. "Why would my name be in your system?" I whispered. "I'm nobody. I'm just a nurse. I've never had anything to do with organized crime." "Your father," he said gently, and the way he said it made my chest tighten with dread. "Richard Torres worked for my father 15 years ago. He was our accountant before he died in a car accident." The room tilted around me, and I gripped the doorframe for support, my father's face swimming up in my memory, his smile when he'd helped me with homework, the way he'd smelled like coffee and aftershave, the grief that had nearly destroyed our family when he'd died. "My father was a legitimate accountant," I said, my voice rising. "He worked for a firm downtown, he did taxes and financial planning, he was a good man." "He was," Dante agreed, standing and moving around the desk toward me. "Until he wasn't. He got involved with my father's business, handled our financial records, managed accounts that needed discretion." "I'm sorry you're finding out this way, Maya." I sank into one of the leather chairs before my legs could give out, staring at the safe visible in the wall behind his desk, at the evidence of wealth built on blood and violence, and understanding that my father had been part of it, had touched it, had maybe died because of it. Everything I thought I knew about my childhood was a lie. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to process this new reality where my father had been connected to organized crime, where the life I remembered was built on foundations I'd never suspected. And then Dante spoke again, and his words shattered what was left of my understanding. "Your sister's cancer treatment," he said quietly, sitting in the chair beside mine rather than behind his desk, removing the barrier between us. "The anonymous donor who's been covering 60% of her costs for the past 2 years, that was my family." The words didn't make sense at first, bouncing off my consciousness like I was hearing a foreign language, and then they crashed through me like a physical blow, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at him as the implications rewrote everything I thought I knew. You've been watching us this whole time, I whispered. And it wasn't a question. Watching me and Elena, tracking our lives, paying our bills, protecting you, he corrected gently. Your father died in service to us. In a car accident that happened because he was driving home late from managing our accounts. We owed his children a debt, and my father took that seriously, made sure you were both provided for in ways that wouldn't draw attention. When I took over after he died, I continued that responsibility. Elena is alive because of mob money, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Every treatment, every medication, every day she's survived. The past 2 years has been paid for with money from drugs or violence or whatever it is you people do. Your sister is alive because your father was a good man who got caught in a bad situation, and we honor our debts, Dante replied. And there was no apology in his voice, just statement of fact. Whether you like the source of the money or not, it kept her alive, kept you from drowning in debt while you tried to save her. I wanted to rage at him, wanted to throw his blood money back in his face and claim some moral high ground, but the truth was, Elena would be dead without those payments. I would have lost her months ago, when the bills exceeded what I could possibly pay, and the gratitude that welled up in me was almost as strong as the horror. Everything I believed about my independence was a lie, I said, my voice breaking. Every shift I worked thinking I was keeping us afloat, every sacrifice I made, and all along you were there in the background controlling everything. Not controlling, he said, and his hand reached out to cover mine where it gripped the chair arm. Supporting. There's a difference. We sat in silence for a long time, the study filled with nothing but the ticking of an antique clock on one of the bookshelves and the sound of our breathing, and eventually, the sky beyond the windows began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Dante stood and gestured for me to follow him, and we walked to the living room where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the sunrise painting the city in shades of gold and pink. I can relocate you and your sister, he said quietly, standing beside me as we watched the light spread across the skyline. New identities, enough money that neither of you would ever have to work if you didn't want to, a place somewhere far from here where the Volkovs will never find you. I felt something twist in my chest at the offer, at the escape he was presenting, but also at what it would cost. My friends, I said softly. My co-workers at Memorial who've become family, the patients at the clinic who depend on me, my entire career that I built from nothing after my father died. All of it would be gone. I'd be someone else, somewhere else, living a lie for the rest of my life. Yes, he agreed, and there was genuine regret in his voice. You'd have safety, but you'd lose yourself in the process. The alternative is staying, fighting, waiting for this war with Volkov to end. And there's no guarantee how long that will take or how it will end. The sun climbed higher, washing the penthouse in warm light, and I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a physical thing. Elena is strong enough to travel, I asked. Her treatments. I'd make sure she had the best oncologists wherever you went, Dante said. Her care would never be interrupted, I give you my word. I need time to think, I said finally, turning to look at him, at this strikingly handsome man who'd crashed into my life and torn it apart and rebuilt it into something I didn't recognize. This is too much, too fast. I can't make this decision right now. Take all the time you need, he replied, and he moved closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the antiseptic from when I'd cleaned his wound. Whatever you decide, I'll make sure you're safe. I owe your father that. He paused, his dark eyes searching mine, and continued in a voice barely above a whisper. And you. He didn't finish the sentence, didn't complete the thought, but something in the way he looked at me made my breath catch and my heart hammer against my ribs, and I understood what he wasn't saying, understood that this had become about more than duty or debt or protection. I spent the day in that gilded cage thinking about choices and freedom and what it meant to be safe versus what it meant to be alive. And when night fell, I finally crawled into the enormous bed and tried to sleep, but my dreams were full of violence and fear. I was back in the clinic, and the Russian had his knife at my throat. But this time Dante didn't burst through the door. This time the blade pressed deeper, and I felt warm blood spilling down my neck as the man smiled and told me I was going to die for helping the wrong person. And I tried to scream, but no sound would come out. I woke gasping, the scream that had been trapped in my dream finally tearing from my throat, and I was tangled in silk sheets that felt like restraints, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. The door burst open and Dante was there, still dressed in the clothes he'd worn at dinner, which meant he hadn't been sleeping, had probably been working in his study, and he crossed the room in 3 long strides. "Maya," he said, his hands on my shoulders, his face close to mine. "You're safe. You're here with me. It was just a dream." "I've never been that scared," I sobbed. And suddenly I was clinging to him, my fingers fisting in his shirt, my face pressed against his chest as tears I'd been holding back all day finally broke free. That knife at my throat, knowing they would kill me, knowing I was going to die in that clinic, and Elena would be alone, and no one would ever know what happened to me. "I know," he said softly, and his arms came around me, strong and warm, one hand stroking my hair in a gesture so gentle it made me cry harder. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I brought this into your life. I'll kill every one of them for putting that fear in you." "More violence isn't the answer," I whispered against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady beneath my cheek. "Killing them won't erase what happened, won't make me feel safe again." "In my world, it's the only answer," he replied, and I felt his lips press against the top of my head, a gesture so tender it made something crack open in my chest. "But I understand if you can't accept that, if you can't accept me." I pulled back enough to look up at his face, illuminated by the city lights filtering through the windows, and saw vulnerability there that matched my own. Saw a man who'd been shaped by violence trying to figure out how to be gentle. And I realized that somewhere between the clinic and this moment, I'd stopped seeing him as a threat and started seeing him as something else entirely. Morning came with weak winter sunlight filtering through the windows, and I found Dante in a room I hadn't entered before, what I could only describe as a war room with maps of the city spread across a large table, photographs pinned to boards on the walls showing faces I didn't recognize, and 3 large monitors displaying what looked like security footage from various locations. Marco, the man who'd been driving the SUV during my forced extraction from the clinic, stood at the table with 2 other men I hadn't met, and they all looked up when I entered, a brief moment of tension before Dante gestured for me to join them. "We found Volkov's accountant," Marco said without preamble, his accent similar to Dante's but thicker, his manner all business. "He's been tracking payments to the Torres family going back 15 years. He knows about the father's connection to us, knows we've been supporting the daughters." Maya listened to this clinical discussion of her life like it was an intelligence briefing, which I supposed it was, and I found myself both horrified and fascinated by this glimpse into Dante's world, the strategic planning, the calculated moves, the way they discussed violence like it was just another business problem to solve. "They think Richard Torres hid something for your family before he died," one of the other men said, pointing to financial records spread across the table. Documents that could destroy them, expose their operations, maybe even bring down their entire organization. "My father didn't hide anything," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "He was killed in a random car accident when I was 13. He didn't have time to hide documents or plan anything. It was just terrible luck." Marco and Dante exchanged a glance, one of those loaded looks that told me they knew something I didn't, and dread settled cold and heavy in my stomach. "Maya," Dante said gently, moving around the table to stand beside 65 me. "Your father's brake lines were cut. The accident wasn't random. It was staged to look like mechanical failure. The room tilted and I grabbed the edge of the table for support, the maps and photographs blurring together as my vision swam. Murdered, I whispered. My father was murdered. We believe he discovered something about Volkov's operations, Marco continued, his voice careful like he was explaining something to a child. Something big enough that they couldn't risk him staying alive even though killing him meant losing a valuable accountant. The insurance investigation ruled it accidental. There was no reason to suspect otherwise until we started digging after Volkov's men went after you. I stared at the photographs on the walls, at the faces of the men who worked for Viktor Volkov, understanding that one of them had killed my father, had cut his brake lines and sent him careening off that bridge, and my grief transformed into something harder and hotter in my chest, something that tasted like rage. I left the war room and walked to the study where Dante found me an hour later, standing at the window overlooking the city spread out below like a glittering web. And when he entered, I spoke before he could. "I'm not running," I said, my voice steady despite the fear still churning in my stomach. "I want the truth about what happened to my father. I want to know what he discovered that was worth killing him over. And I want Volkov to pay for taking him from us." "Maya, this is too dangerous," Dante said, moving to stand beside me. "Volkov's men won't hesitate to kill you. They've already tried once. And if they realize you're actively helping me, then you become an even bigger target. You said my father was a good man, caught in a bad situation," I replied, turning to face him fully. "I want to know what that situation was. I want to understand what he was involved in and why he died. And I can't do that from some safe house in another city with a fake name and a fake life." "You're not a killer," he said softly, his dark eyes searching mine. "You're a nurse. You save lives. You don't take them." "No," I agreed, holding his gaze. "But you are. And if what you're doing ends the man who killed my father, if your war with Volkov brings him down and exposes whatever my father discovered, then I'll help however I can." I saw something shift in his expression, surprise maybe, or respect, or desire, and he reached out to cup my face with one hand, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone in a gesture that made my breath catch. "You understand what you're choosing," he said. "Once you make this decision, once you become part of this actively instead of just a victim caught in the crossfire, there's no going back." "I understand," I whispered, and I did. I understood that I was choosing violence and danger and a world I'd never wanted to be part of, but I also understood that running away wouldn't bring my father back, wouldn't give me answers, wouldn't make me feel anything except like a coward who'd let his murder go unpunished. "Then we do this together," Dante said, and something in the way he said it felt like a vow, like a promise that went deeper than just strategy and revenge. "We find out what your father discovered, we use it to destroy Volkov, and we make sure everyone knows why he's falling, that it's Richard Torres reaching from beyond the grave to bring down the man who killed him." "Yes," I said, and when he pulled me into his arms, I went willingly, pressing my face against his chest and feeling his heart beat strong and steady beneath my cheek. And I knew that somewhere in the past 48 hours, I'd crossed a line I could never uncross, had stepped from my world into his, and chosen to stay even knowing the cost. That evening, I found Dante in the small medical room where supplies were kept, and I could see immediately that something was wrong from the tension in his shoulders and the blood dripping from his right hand. "What happened?" I asked, moving toward him automatically, my nurse training overriding everything else. He looked at the wall where I could see the impact mark, the drywall cracked and dented, and I understood he'd punched it in frustration, probably over the situation with Volkov or the danger I was in or both. "Let me see," I said, taking his hand gently and examining the split knuckles, the abraded skin, and I led him to sit on the exam table while I gathered antiseptic and bandages. We were close in the small space, my body between his knees as I cleaned the wound, and I could feel the heat radiating from him, could hear his breathing change as I worked. "You should hate me," he said softly, and when I looked up, his face was inches from mine, those dark eyes intense and searching. I should, I agreed, not moving away even though every rational part of my brain screamed that I should put distance between us. You've kidnapped me, lied to me, controlled my life, pulled me into a war I never wanted to be part of. But I don't hate you. His hand came up to cup my cheek, the uninjured one, and I found myself leaning into his touch, my eyes closing briefly at the gentleness of it. Why not? He whispered. Why don't you hate me when you have every reason to? Because you came back for me, I said, opening my eyes to meet his gaze. Because you've protected my sister for years, without asking for anything in return. Because you look at me like I matter, like I'm more than just a debt to be paid. Then his mouth was on mine, and I was kissing him back before I could think, before I could question or analyze or talk myself out of it. My hands fisting in his shirt and pulling him closer as weeks of tension exploded between us. The kiss was deep and consuming, his tongue sliding against mine, his hand tangling in my hair while the other pulled me tight against him, and I could feel my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. This is insane, I gasped when we broke apart for air, my forehead pressed against his. Yes, he agreed, his voice rough with desire. We barely know each other, I continued, even as my fingers traced the line of his jaw, the strong column of his throat. I know enough, he said, capturing my hand and pressing a kiss to my palm. I know you're brave and stubborn and compassionate and stronger than you realize, and I've never wanted anyone the way I want you, Maya Torres. I woke in Dante's bed with morning light streaming through the windows and his arm heavy across my waist, and for a moment I let myself exist in that space between sleep and waking where nothing was complicated, and I was just a woman lying next to a strikingly handsome man who'd made me feel things I'd forgotten I was capable of feeling. His eyes opened and found mine, and something passed between us, an acknowledgement of what had changed, what we'd crossed, and he pulled me closer and kissed me slow and deep until my body melted against his. But reality intruded as it always does, and within an hour, we were dressed and back in the war room where Marco was waiting with news that made my pulse quicken with equal parts hope and dread. We found a storage unit, he said, spreading papers across the table. Rented under Richard Torres's name 15 years ago, payments automatically withdrawn from an account that's still active, never been closed out or accessed since the month he died. If Volkov thinks my father hid something, I said, leaning over the table to study the documents, then maybe he did. Maybe whatever got him killed is sitting in that storage unit waiting to be found. Then we find it first, Dante said, his hand settling on the small of my back in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. Before Volkov's people figure out it exists. The storage unit is in the warehouse district, Marco continued, pointing to a map. Bad neighborhood, mostly abandoned buildings, the kind of place where questions don't get asked and security cameras don't work. Which means it's also the kind of place where Volkov's men could be watching, waiting to see if anyone shows up, one of the other men added. It's a trap waiting to happen. We go prepared, Dante said, his voice taking on that commanding tone I'd heard in the clinic. Full team, multiple vehicles, weapons ready. We treat this like a military operation because that's what it is. I found myself nodding, accepting this new reality where I was part of planning sessions about storage units and ambushes and violent men, and I understood that I'd truly crossed into his world now. Wasn't just a victim or a prisoner, but an active participant in whatever came next. The storage unit key has to be somewhere, I said, thinking out loud. My father wouldn't have rented it without keeping the key accessible, maybe in his personal effects, or hidden somewhere in our old house. The house was sold after he died, Dante replied. But we can track down the buyers, search the property if needed, or check if he had a safety deposit box at his bank. Every minute we wait is another minute for Volkov to find it first, Marco warned, and I felt the urgency thrumming through the room like a living thing. The storage facility was exactly the kind of place nightmares were made of, a sprawling complex of corrugated metal units in an industrial area where half the buildings were abandoned and graffiti covered every surface like a disease. We arrived in 3 black SUVs, Dante's men spreading out with military precision, weapons visible now because there was no point in pretending this was anything other than what it was. And I felt my heart hammering against my ribs as we approached Unit 247, where my father had apparently hidden something worth killing for. "Stay in the car," Dante said, his hand on my arm, his eyes hard with determination. "This could be dangerous, and I need to know you're safe." "I'm not staying in the car," I replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "That's my father's unit. Whatever's in there belongs to me, and I'm not going to hide while you risk your life for my family's secrets." He studied me for a moment and then nodded once, accepting my stubbornness, and together we approached the unit with Marco and 2 other men flanking us. The lock had been broken recently. I could see fresh scratches on the metal, and when Dante rolled up the door, the hinges screamed in protest, and the smell of dust and old memories washed over me. Inside were boxes and furniture I recognized from my childhood home. The couch my mother had loved, the desk where my father had paid bills, cardboard boxes labeled in his handwriting with words like tax records, and financial files, and seeing these remnants of my past life made my throat tight with grief. Dante stepped inside first, his gun drawn, and I followed close behind, my eyes scanning the dim interior lit only by the weak sunlight filtering through the open door. He froze suddenly, his arm shooting out to stop me, and I saw what he'd seen: a thin wire stretched across the floor at ankle height, nearly invisible in the shadows. "Get back," he shouted, yanking me toward the door. And we'd made it maybe 3 steps when the world exploded in fire and noise, and I was flying through the air, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the breath from my lungs. My ears rang and smoke filled my vision, and through the chaos, I heard gunfire, saw Dante on top of me shielding my body with his as bullets tore through the air above us. Volkov's men emerged from the surrounding units like rats from sewers, at least 6 of them with automatic weapons. And Dante's team returned fire with deadly precision, the sound deafening in the enclosed space between metal buildings. Dante hauled me to my feet and we ran in a crouch toward the SUVs, bullets kicking up concrete dust around our feet. And I saw 2 of his men go down, saw Marco take a hit to his shoulder but keep moving, returning fire with grim efficiency. We were almost to the vehicle when I heard Dante grunt and stumble, and when I looked down, I saw blood spreading across his left thigh, dark and fast, and terror cut through my adrenaline haze. "You're bleeding," I shouted, trying to support his weight as he pushed me toward the driver's side door. "Drive!" he commanded, shoving me behind the wheel as he collapsed into the passenger seat, his hand already pressing hard against the wound. I didn't hesitate, didn't freeze, my medical training kicking in and overriding my fear as I turned the key and slammed my foot on the accelerator, the SUV lurching forward as bullets punched through the rear window. Dante was on his phone barking orders to Marco and the others, telling them to split up and lead any pursuers away from us, and then he was giving me directions to a secondary safe house, his voice tight with pain but steady. I drove like I'd never driven before, taking corners too fast and running red lights, my eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror to check if we were being followed, and beside me, Dante had his belt off and was using it as a makeshift tourniquet above the wound. "How bad is it?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm despite the chaos. "Through and through," he said, and I could hear the pain he was trying to hide. "Missed the bone, I think, but it's bleeding heavy." "Don't you dare die on me, Dante Moretti," I said, taking another corner so fast the tires screamed. "You don't get to pull me into your world and make me care about you and then die in my passenger seat." "Not planning to," he replied, and despite everything, there was warmth in his voice. I have too much to live for now. The safe house was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where minivans sat in driveways and kids played in yards, so ordinary and normal that it was the perfect hiding place. And I pulled into the attached garage that Dante opened with a remote from the glove box. The second the garage door closed behind us, I was out of the car and around to his side, assessing the wound with clinical detachment even as my hands shook. "We need to get you inside," I said. "I need supplies. Need to clean this and stop the bleeding properly. You've already lost too much blood." He leaned on me heavily as we made our way into the house, leaving a trail of blood across pristine tile floors. And I couldn't help but think how we'd reversed from that first night in the clinic, how now I was the one guiding him to safety, how now he was the one bleeding and dependent on my skills to survive. The kitchen table became my operating room, and I sent one of the men to find the medical supplies that Dante said were hidden in every safe house, and when he returned with a fully stocked trauma kit, I laid out what I needed, with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. I had to cut away his pants leg to access the wound properly, and when I examined it closely, I realized he'd been wrong. The bullet hadn't gone through, it was lodged in the muscle and would need to be extracted. "This is going to hurt," I told him, meeting his eyes as he sat on the table, his face pale from blood loss but his jaw set with determination. "No anesthetic. I don't have anything strong enough, and we can't risk you being unconscious if Volkov's men tracked us here. Do what you need to do," he said simply, and I saw him grip the edge of the table as I began to clean the wound, irrigating it with saline to clear away blood and debris. Marco arrived while I was working, his own shoulder bandaged where he'd taken a hit, and he positioned himself near the window, watching the quiet suburban street for any sign of trouble. "Boss," he said, and something in his voice made both Dante and me look up. "We found something in the rubble at the storage unit, a safety deposit box key taped under one of the desk drawers. It survived the explosion." My heart leaped even as my hands continued their careful work, using forceps to probe the wound for the bullet. And I felt Dante tense beneath my touch, but he didn't make a sound. "What bank?" Dante asked through gritted teeth. "First National downtown," Marco replied. "Same branch where your father did business. The key has the bank logo and a box number engraved on it." I found the bullet finally, a small piece of metal that had caused so much damage, and I extracted it carefully, dropping it into a metal tray with a clink that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet kitchen. "Almost done," I murmured to Dante, beginning to pack the wound with antibiotic gauze. "You're doing great. Just hold on a little longer." "You came back for me," I said softly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "At the storage unit when the explosion happened, you covered me with your body, took a bullet meant for me." "Always," he replied, his dark eyes finding mine despite the pain I knew he was feeling. "I'll always come back for you, Maya. I'll always protect you no matter what it costs." I felt tears burn behind my eyes as I began suturing the wound closed, my movements practiced and efficient, and I understood that what had started as obligation and debt had transformed into something deeper, something that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. 2 days later, Dante could walk with only a slight limp, and he insisted we go to the bank despite my protests that he needed more time to heal. But I understood the urgency, because every hour we waited was another hour for Volkov to discover what we were looking for. First National was the kind of old institution with marble floors and columns that spoke of money and power, and when we presented the key, a nervous manager led us to a private room where the safety deposit box waited. And my hands trembled as I opened it to find 3 leather-bound ledgers filled with my father's precise handwriting. The ledgers contained everything: detailed records of Volkov's operations spanning 15 years, human trafficking routes with names and dates and monetary amounts, political bribes documented with recipient names and bank account numbers, murders listed clinically with victims and methods and payments made to the killers. I felt sick reading through the pages, seeing the scope of evil my father had been forced to document, understanding the weight he must have carried, knowing what these numbers represented. Tucked into the front of the first ledger was a note in my father's handwriting, and I had to read it 3 times before the words made sense through my tears. To whomever finds this, I couldn't be part of this anymore. I was going to give this to the FBI. I hope I succeeded. If you're reading this, I probably didn't. Tell my daughters I love them, and I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. He was going to testify, I whispered, looking up at Dante through blurred vision. That's why they killed him. He was going to bring all of this to the authorities, and Volkov found out. He would be proud of you, Dante said softly, his hand covering mine on the table. Proud that you're finishing what he started, that you're brave enough to see this through. I wept then, great shaking sobs that I couldn't control, grief and rage and vindication all mixing together until I couldn't breathe. And Dante pulled me into his arms and held me while I fell apart in that quiet bank room, surrounded by evidence of my father's courage and the evil that had killed him for it. My father hadn't been a criminal, hadn't chosen this life. He'd been a good man trapped in an impossible situation who'd tried to do the right thing at the cost of his own life. And now, 15 years later, his daughters would finish what he'd started and make sure Viktor Volkov paid for every life documented in those ledgers. We left the bank with the ledgers secured in a briefcase that Dante held like it contained explosives, which in a way it did. And I felt something settle in my chest, a certainty that what we were doing was right, even if the methods were questionable, that my father's death would not be meaningless, that his courage would finally bring down the monster who'd stolen him from us. Back at the main penthouse, we spread the ledgers across the war room table, and I watched Dante and his men study the contents with the kind of focus that made me understand why he'd survived in a world where most men died young, and when he finally looked up, his face was set with grim determination. "We give this to the feds," he said, his finger tapping the damning evidence my father had compiled. "Anonymously, through channels that can't be traced back to us, and we let them destroy Volkov legally with indictments and trials and prison sentences that will dismantle his entire empire." "But first," I interrupted, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "First, I want to face him. I want Viktor Volkov to know why he's losing everything. I want him to hear my father's name and understand that Richard Torres is reaching from beyond the grave to destroy him." Dante's eyes met mine, and I saw approval there, saw understanding that this wasn't just about justice, but about closure, about my father's memory being vindicated. Marco shook his head from where he stood studying a map of the city, his shoulders still bandaged from the storage unit firefight. "This is a suicide mission," he said bluntly. "Volkov won't come alone to any meeting. He'll bring an army. And even if we survive the initial confrontation, he has resources we can't match in a prolonged war." "Then we plan carefully," Dante replied, moving to stand beside Marco at the map. "We arrange a meet in neutral territory, somewhere public enough that he'll feel safe, but contained enough that we control the exits, and we make him think we want to sell the ledgers back to him." "He'll never believe that," one of the other men argued. "He'll know it's a trap." "Not if we make him desperate enough," I said, an idea forming even as I spoke. "We leak information that we have the evidence, that we're shopping it to the highest bidder, his competitors or the FBI or whoever pays the most, and we give him 24 hours to make an offer. Greed and fear will override his caution." Dante looked at me with something like pride in his dark eyes and nodded slowly. "We set the meet for tomorrow night," he said. "Abandoned warehouse by the docks, my territory, so I can position my men strategically, and we tip off the FBI to raid the location 30 minutes after we arrive. They get Volkov and all his men in one place with evidence in hand. We get our confrontation, and if everything goes according to plan, we all walk away alive." "And if it doesn't go according to plan?" Marco asked quietly. "Then, we make sure Maya gets out safely," Dante replied without hesitation. "Whatever happens to me or any of us, she survives to see her father's justice done." The warehouse Dante chose was exactly what I expected from every crime movie I'd ever seen. All rusted metal and broken windows, and the smell of salt water from the docks nearby. And as evening fell and we arrived in a convoy of black SUVs, I felt my stomach twist with fear and anticipation. The FBI had been tipped off through an anonymous burner phone dropped in a trash can. The message simple and untraceable. Viktor Volkov would be at this location at 8 p.m. with evidence of multiple federal crimes, and they would raid exactly 20 minutes after the meeting was scheduled to begin, which meant we had 20 minutes to confront Volkov and get out before law enforcement swarmed the place. "I'm coming with you," I said to Dante for the third time as his men took positions throughout the warehouse, some visible and some hidden in the shadows and rafters. And he turned to look at me with frustration and fear warring in his dark eyes. "Maya, this is too dangerous," he said, his hands gripping my shoulders. "Volkov is a monster. He's killed dozens of people personally and ordered the deaths of hundreds more if something goes wrong." "My father," I interrupted firmly. "My right to face his killer, you don't get to protect me from this, not when we've come this far." He studied my face for a long moment and then nodded once, reaching into a bag one of his men had carried in and withdrawing a bulletproof vest that he helped me put on, his fingers gentle as he adjusted the straps and checked the fit. The weight of it was surprising, heavy and uncomfortable, and then he was pressing a small handgun into my palm, a Glock 9mm that felt alien and deadly in my grip. "Safety is here," he said, showing me the mechanism. "Point and shoot if you have to. Don't think, just act. And if anything happens to me, you run. You get to one of my men and they'll get you out." "Nothing is going to happen to you," I said fiercely, gripping his hand. "We're both walking out of this. We're both going to see Volkov arrested and my father vindicated." His other hand came up to cup my face and he leaned down to kiss me, slow and deep and full of things we hadn't said out loud. And when we broke apart, I could see the fear he was trying to hide, the understanding that this could go wrong in 1,000 different ways. Marco appeared in the doorway to signal that Volkov's convoy had been spotted approaching, and Dante took my hand and led me to a position behind several large shipping crates that would provide cover, and I felt the gun heavy in my pocket, and the vest constricting my breathing, and the knowledge that in minutes I would face the man who'd murdered my father settling over me like a shroud. The sound of engines cut through the warehouse silence, and then doors slamming and footsteps echoing on concrete. And Viktor Volkov walked through the main entrance, flanked by at least a dozen men in dark suits, all armed, all moving with the confidence of people who expected to win. Volkov himself was older than I'd expected, maybe 60, with silver hair slicked back from a face that was all sharp angles and cold calculation, his accent thick as honey and just as cloying when he spoke. "So this is the great Dante Moretti and his mysterious leverage," he said, his pale eyes scanning the warehouse before landing on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "And who is this? Your nurse, perhaps, the one my men told me about." I stepped forward before Dante could stop me, before I could lose my courage, and met Volkov's gaze directly. "I'm Richard Torres's daughter," I said, my voice steady despite the fear racing through my veins. "And you killed him 15 years ago because he was going to expose everything you'd done." Something flickered in Volkov's expression, surprise maybe, or amusement, and he moved closer with his men maintaining formation around him. "Richard Torres' daughter," he repeated, studying my face with the kind of attention that made me feel like an insect under glass. "Yes, I see it now. You have his eyes, his stubborn chin. Your father was weak, girl. He forgot where his loyalties lay." "His loyalty was to his conscience," I replied, my hand moving to my pocket where the gun waited. "Something you've never had. He was going to bring you down, and you murdered him for it." Volkov laughed, a sound without humor that echoed off the metal walls. "And now you think to finish what he started. You bring me his evidence thinking I will pay you for it like some common blackmailer, stupid girl." "We're not selling anything," Dante said, his voice carrying across the space between our groups. "We just wanted you to know that in about 15 minutes, this warehouse will be swarming with federal agents. And those ledgers Richard Torres compiled are already in FBI hands, along with testimony placing you at the scene of multiple murders." Volkov's expression darkened and his men tensed, hands moving toward weapons, and I saw Dante's men do the same from their positions throughout the warehouse, everyone on a hair trigger waiting for the violence to begin. "You're bluffing," Volkov said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "No one has those ledgers. Torres hid them too well. We searched for years." "My father wanted you to rot in prison," I said, pulling the gun from my pocket with shaking hands and pointing it at Volkov's chest, even though I'd never fired a weapon in my life. "And that's exactly what's going to happen. You're going to pay for every life you've destroyed, starting with his." Volkov's smile turned predatory, and he raised one hand in a gesture I didn't understand until I saw the red dot appear on my chest. A laser sight from somewhere above, and everything happened at once as Dante shouted my name and threw himself in front of me just as the shot rang out. He went down, hard, and I screamed, thinking he'd been killed, but he was moving, gasping for air. The bullet caught by the vest he wore, and then the world exploded into chaos as both sides opened fire simultaneously. I grabbed Dante and dragged him behind the shipping crates, my arms burning with the effort, bullets punching holes in metal and concrete all around us, the sound deafening and terrifying, and somehow sharpening my focus to a crystal edge. "Return fire," Dante gasped, his hand pressed to his chest where the impact had bruised or broken his ribs. "Maya, you have to shoot back, or they'll flank us." I pulled the gun from where I'd dropped it and leaned around the crate, pointing at the nearest of Volkov's men and pulling the trigger, the recoil jerking my arm up and the shot going wild. But I fired again and again until the man went down, and I didn't know if I'd hit him or if it was one of Dante's men, but I kept shooting because that's what survival looked like now. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, and I heard Volkov shouting orders in Russian, saw him moving toward a back exit with 3 of his men, trying to escape before the FBI arrived. Dante struggled to his feet despite my protests, his face pale with pain, but his eyes burning with determination. "Stay here," he commanded, already moving after Volkov with a limp that told me his old leg wound had reopened. I followed anyway because I was done staying behind, done being protected, done letting men make decisions about my safety when my father's killer was about to escape. I reached the back area just as Dante caught up to Volkov, and the older man spun with surprising speed, a knife appearing in his hand, slashing toward Dante's throat. They grappled, both breathing hard, blood from Dante's reopened leg wound spreading across his pants, and I raised my gun with shaking hands but couldn't get a clear shot with them so close together. Dante landed a punch to Volkov's jaw that sent him staggering, then another to his ribs, and the knife clattered to the concrete as Volkov fell to his knees. And through the open warehouse doors I could see red and blue lights flashing, hear shouting as federal agents swarmed the building, and I knew it was over, knew my father's justice had finally come. Dante stood over Volkov with his gun pointed at the older man's head, and I stumbled forward to stand beside him, my own weapon trained on the man who'd murdered my father, and for a moment we stood there like that, judge and jury, the power of life and death in our trembling hands. "You don't have the courage," Volkov spat, blood running from his split lip, his pale eyes full of contempt. "You're not killers, you're children playing at a game you don't understand." The warehouse doors burst open and suddenly the space was flooded with people in FBI windbreakers shouting commands, weapons drawn, tactical lights cutting through the smoke and shadows. "Drop your weapons," a voice boomed through a megaphone. Everyone on the ground now. Dante and I lowered our guns slowly, carefully, and I felt hands pulling me away from Volkov as agents swarmed around him, yanking him to his feet and forcing his hands behind his back. I struggled against the agent holding me, needing to say this, needing Volkov to hear it before they took him away. My father's name was Richard Torres, I shouted, my voice cracking with emotion. You took him from his daughters when I was 13 years old. You stole 15 years of his life from us. And now we're taking everything from you. Volkov's eyes met mine as they dragged him toward the exit, and I saw something flicker there. Recognition, maybe, or the first hint of fear as he realized what was coming. You think this ends it, he snarled. My organization will continue. You've accomplished nothing. Your organization is done, Dante said, his arm around my waist supporting both of us as we watched the arrest unfold. Everyone in that ledger is being arrested right now. Every politician you bribed is being investigated. Every route you controlled is being shut down, and you're going to spend whatever life you have left in a federal prison watching everything you built crumble to dust. More agents flooded the warehouse, securing Volkov's men who'd survived the firefight, calling for ambulances for the wounded, and I saw them find the briefcase with the ledgers that we'd positioned exactly where they'd be discovered, evidence wrapped in a bow for prosecution. Marco appeared at Dante's other side, his face grim but satisfied, reporting that all of Dante's men had made it out alive, though several were wounded, and the FBI was too focused on Volkov and his people to pay much attention to us. Time to go, Marco said quietly. Before they start asking questions we don't want to answer. Dante nodded, and we moved toward a side exit, leaving the chaos behind. And as we stepped out into the cool night air filled with sirens and flashing lights, I felt something release in my chest, a weight I'd carried for 15 years without knowing it. And I understood that my father could finally rest, because his courage had brought down a monster, and his daughters had finished what he started. 3 weeks later, I stood in my apartment that no longer felt quite like mine, because everything had changed. The debt collectors had stopped calling because every bill had been paid in full. Elena's cancer treatment was fully funded through a legitimate charitable foundation that Dante had established, and my father's name had been cleared in a series of news articles about his role in bringing down the Volkov organization posthumously. The FBI had seized assets worth hundreds of millions, arrested 47 people connected to the trafficking and murder conspiracies, and Viktor Volkov himself was facing life in prison without possibility of parole. And through it all, Dante and I had given statements through lawyers, but remained mostly invisible, just two witnesses in a case built on my father's courage. I didn't have to work anymore. The money Dante had quietly transferred to my accounts was enough to live on for years. But I'd gone back to both the hospital and the clinic because nursing was who I was, not just what I did to survive, and I needed that purpose, that connection to the person I'd been before a wounded stranger stumbled through my door and changed everything. The knock came at noon on a Saturday, and I opened the door to find Dante standing there, healed now, no more limp from his leg wound, strikingly handsome in a charcoal suit that made him look like the legitimate businessman he was becoming, and he smiled when he saw me. The FBI made deals, he said without preamble. I'm out, legitimately. My family's businesses are being cleaned, the illegal operations shut down. It'll take years, but we're building something better. He held out his hand to me, and I stared at it, understanding what he was offering, what he was asking. Come with me, he continued. Be part of building something better, not because you owe me anything, not because you need protection, but because you want to. What are you asking? I whispered, my heart hammering in my chest. I'm asking you to choose me, he replied, his dark eyes intense on mine. Not because of debts or danger, or the connection between our fathers. Just because you want to, because what we found in all that chaos is worth holding on to. I took his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine, and smiled through tears I hadn't realized were falling. I choose you, I said. I choose us. I choose whatever future we can build together. He pulled me into his arms and kissed me deep and consuming. And when we broke apart, he pressed his forehead to mine and said softly, I've been yours since the moment you told me to sit still while you stitched me up. since you looked at me without fear and saw a man instead of a monster. We walked out of my apartment together toward his car, waiting at the curb, and I understood that we were equals now, partners choosing each other freely, and that the woman who'd treated a wounded stranger's injuries without knowing he was a mafia boss had survived his enemies arriving and found something more valuable than safety in the chaos. She'd found love and purpose and a future worth fighting for.